The neighbors of Erskine Presbyterian Church in Hamilton, Ontario were suspicious. They had seen a large, unmarked, sealed, unlabeled box sitting on the steps of the church. And it had been there for quite a while, like a day and a half. It was pushing 2 days. The box had been just sitting there, and they were worried. So they called the police and asked the police to investigate. And the police arrived and took a look, and they didn't want to touch the box, didn't want to move it. They called the bomb squad. The bomb squad arrived and looked at it. They didn't want to touch it. They didn't want to move it. But they had this, the portable X-ray device. So they tried to X-ray the box to see what was in it. Well, the results were inconclusive. It was shadowy. It was vague. They weren't sure what was in the box. So it seemed that in this suspicious, security-conscious world, there was only one course of action. They set up sandbags around the box, on 3 sides of the box, built it up. And one of the bomb squad members took aim with a bazooka-like device, kind of a rocket launcher. He took aim, fired, and blasted the box to bits. When the smoke cleared, people saw pieces of paper descending to the earth, kind of like feathers floating down to the earth. And somebody went over and looked at one of the scraps of paper and found out what precisely was in the box. Sunday school curriculum. Yes, Sunday school curriculum. The publisher of this Sunday school curriculum, Ralph Milton, found out about this incident and later commented. He had this to say: "The bomb squad did the right thing. I know that curriculum pretty well, even had a hand in publishing it, and blowing it sky high is the only proper way to dispose of it. It's full of subversive ideas like love your enemies, and love is more important than power, and be fair to each other, especially the folks who are at the bottom of the heap, and it's better to give than to receive, and justice shall flow like a river." Ideas like that should be blown to smithereens, because if people ever took them seriously, they would turn the world upside down. In fact, did you know that according to Acts chapter 17, that's what Christians are called? People who are turning the world upside down? Well, today is Pentecost Sunday, and according to Acts chapter 2, we learn about Pentecost. All the disciples are gathered in this house, and suddenly they hear from heaven a sound like the rush of a violent wind. And then fire descended upon them and rested upon each disciple, and they began to speak in different languages as the Spirit gave them the ability. And from there they dispersed off and started the early church. That, in a nutshell, is the story of Pentecost. But let's back up just a bit here. Violent wind, fire. Violent wind and fire. You might say that the disciples were blasted by the Spirit. And when the smoke cleared and when the pieces of paper came floating down to the earth, people were left wondering, what in the world has happened here? Blasted by the Spirit. Sometimes I wonder if we Presbyterians don't do a slight disservice to Pentecost. I mean, we're so concerned about doing everything decently and in order. We're so concerned about control. And even when we reenact the story of Pentecost, as we often do, we have people lined up in rows in the pews, and first, one stands up and reads a selection from Acts chapter 2 in English, and then another stands up following that and reads it perhaps in German and French and Spanish and Greek, and then if we're really feeling daring, everybody will start reading that passage together at the same time. But we're so hushed and reverential and differential, whatever the word is, that sometimes you're left wondering, where's the fire? Where's the wind? You see, on that first Pentecost, there was quite a commotion, so much so, in fact, that the neighbors of this house where the disciples were, the neighbors thought a party had been raging from the night through to the wee hours of the morning. And they sneered and they made comments and jokes. They thought the disciples were drunk, not just drunk, but blasted. There was such a commotion going on. Hey! Keep it down in there. It's morning, for God's sake. Blasted by the Spirit. That's really a pretty good word for what the Spirit does. I mean, it's a bit shocking for us to think of it in those terms, but it's not a bad word, because not only at Pentecost did the neighbors think that the disciples were drunk, they weren't. Not only at Pentecost, well, if you look up in the Merriam-Webster definition of blast, you know what it means? They say it's a violent gust of wind. That's what happened at Pentecost, a violent rush of wind. And not only is the Spirit in both Hebrew and in Greek versions of the Bible also translated as wind as well as spirit, but also blasted is a pretty good way to think of it, because when the Spirit moves in people's lives and in society, people's lives and society is often turned upside down. There's turmoil. There's upheaval. People feel that their nicely ordered lives are being blasted apart. Think of the civil rights movement in the 60s. Think of what you've read about the abolitionist movement in the 1800s, or the women's rights movement in the early 1900s, or then again in the 1970s, or the fall of communism. When the Spirit moves, individual lives and society itself is reordered to be more in accordance with love and compassion and justice and mercy and more inclusion and less exclusion. And when that happens, there's often an accompanying wind and fire. People sneer. People make derogatory comments. People get angry. People attack. When you think of the Holy Spirit, think blasted. Another Spirit story, Numbers chapter 11. Numbers chapter 11. We read about Moses. The people have been just freed from slavery. They've made their escape from Egypt. And Moses is leading them through the wilderness, the desert wilderness. But things are getting pretty rough. Moses has been having a tough time of it, because the people are mumbling. The people are grumbling. They're saying, "Why did you lead us out here in the desert to die? We would have been better off in Egypt." Well, at least there as slaves, we had food. They're mumbling and they're grumbling, and they're not satisfied anymore with the manna that came from heaven. They want meat. And a little later on, Moses, to satisfy their carnivorous appetites, is going to provide, through the Spirit of God, a flock of quail. But we're not there yet.